The 13th item on our agenda is a pre-hearing review of zoning map and zoning text amendments in Manhattan Community District 2. Our presenters are Sylvia Lee and Andy Cantu.
Great. Thanks, Ryan. Good afternoon, commissioners. As you know, this is a long time coming, a major planning project the Manhattan office and the department has been working on for a number of years, and a critical initiative to advance broad citywide goals such as housing affordability, equity, and inclusion. We are very excited to be back to discuss the SoHo NoHo neighborhood plan in advance of the public hearing. As you'll see, that we've been listening and absorbing so much of the public discourse, and we will be responding with additional details on aspects of the plan. Today, we're going to briefly review the core elements of the SoHo NoHo neighborhood plan, such as the bulk and use requirements, and address questions and comments that emerged during the public review process.
Hi, Andy, thank you very much. And hello, commissioners. It's good to see you all today. Before we proceed to our presentation, we did want to start with some comments from the chair and as well as from the executive director. Marisa, are you available?
I'm sorry. I am going to be making comments at the time of the public hearing, but not today.
Okay, excuse me. Anita?
I'm here.
Okay, thank you, Anita.
Sure. Good afternoon, commissioners. Before our team gets started this afternoon, I'm just going to say a few words. There's certainly no question that neighborhood change can be challenging and that all voices need to be heard as we move through a rezoning process. However, there is absolutely no excuse for the abusive and disrespectful words, including racist comments that we've heard repeatedly throughout this planning process. One that seeks to make these two high opportunity Manhattan neighborhoods much fairer and more inclusive. We've not heard this kind of vitriolic language as we work through other neighborhood plans, and it simply must not and cannot be tolerated here. I commend the unwavering professionalism of city staff here at DCP, the Department of Cultural Affairs, HPD, and other city agencies, and in the offices of Borough President Gail Brewer and Councilmember Margaret Chen, so many of whose staff, like me, represent communities of color in our wonderfully diverse city. Thank you. Sylvia, I'm going to turn the mic over to you, but before I do, let me say thank you sincerely to you and to Andy and to so many others who are working behind the scenes at DCP for your stellar professionalism and dedication throughout this process. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Anita. Thank you for the opening remarks. As Andy mentioned, we will go over a brief presentation as a reminder of the proposal that the Commission saw as certification with additional information in response to the comments that we've heard during ULURP to date. Andy, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Anita. And thank you, Sylvia. I'm sorry, I jumped the gun a little bit. Jeff, can we skip ahead 2 slides, please? Or 1 slide? Thanks. So to briefly recap for the Commission, the SoHo NoHo neighborhood plan is centered around 5 major objectives. So first, allow housing and require permanently affordable housing for the very first time in SoHo and NoHo. Second, introduce mechanisms to directly support and enhance arts and cultural uses. Third, recognize and reinforce critical economic and job generating uses, including broadening the definition of live work. Fourth, implement, again for the first time, bulk controls that limit the size of new developments to match these neighborhoods' historic character. And fifth, address quality of life and public realm concerns. Next slide, please. As we noted at certification, this proposal is a culmination of years of engagement with community stakeholders, which officially launched in January of 2019 with the start of the envisioned SoHo NoHo process, and continued in months of additional public events leading up to this proposal's certification on May 17th. Next slide, please. So again, very briefly, the study area consists of SoHo NoHo Manhattan Community District 2. The majority, over 80% of the area, is within and protected by 6 city designated historic districts. These neighborhoods are centrally located between 2 of the country's largest business districts, with excellent transit connectivity, tens of thousands of important jobs, and adjacent to dynamic and vibrant communities in their own right. But these special qualities are hampered by 50-year-old zoning in the form of 2 outdated manufacturing zoning districts, M15A and M15B, which were established in 1971 when land use and socioeconomic conditions in SoHo and NoHo and our city in general were drastically different. Next slide, please. So this application consists of 2 land use actions, a zoning map amendment, which would replace the outdated manufacturing zoning districts with new medium and high density mixed use districts, and mapped a special SoHo NoHo mixed use district. And a zoning text amendment, which would establish additional bespoke rules suited to SoHo and NoHo's unique needs, as well as map mandatory inclusionary housing, MIH, across the entire rezoning area. So first, I'm going to provide an overview of the proposed use and bulk regulations, then spend more time on affordable housing, as well as the proposed arts fund, and then finally, summarize the community boards and the borough president's recommendations. Next slide, please. So SoHo and NoHo are incredibly diverse neighborhoods, both in terms of their built character and their mix of uses. The proposed zoning districts are designed to reflect and enhance the loft building typology that makes these neighborhoods so unique. So allowable floor area ratios in the historic districts and corridors, which are shown in pink and blue, are consistent with many of the historic buildings found in these areas. The opportunity areas, which are shown in yellow, which are largely outside of historic districts, are where the majority of new housing development is projected to occur, and where the largest increase in density is proposed. Unlike today's outdated manufacturing zoning, which does not have defined height limits, the proposed zoning has strict building envelopes that better align zoning with the prevailing historic form. History has been our guide in this respect, and we've developed base height and maximum building height regulations that mirror the loft building typologies. Additional bulk controls like required setbacks and relaxed rear yard requirements would allow for more flexible site planning and ensure access to light and air. In addition to the landmarks preservation's ultimate discretion over development in the historic districts, the special district rules also allow the LPC to modify base heights without obtaining discretionary approvals from the Planning Commission. And this is intended to help new development fit within the existing fabric, where the LPC believes it would result in more appropriate building designs, such as aligning cornices to adjacent buildings. And finally, the special district would mandate active ground floor uses minimum transparency requirements, and other urban design controls along the neighborhood's more commercial streets to activate these corridors and provide an enhanced pedestrian experience. Next slide, please. So in terms of built form, SoHo and NoHo are highly varied, which means there is not a one-size-fits-all approach to zoning. The bulk rules have been carefully considered based on stakeholder feedback and curated to reflect the scale and character of both the unique sub-areas within SoHo and NoHo, as well as the surrounding neighborhoods. So for example, the 330-foot tall hotel in the foreground, which is out of sync with the prevailing context, is the type of tower that would not be allowed with the proposed height limits. I also want to note the scale of the buildings to the south and west of the rezoning area. The 445-foot tall AT&T building on the far left of the image, which is built in 1932, illustrates that SoHo and NoHo have existed side by side with very tall and bulky buildings for essentially over a century. And the proposed bulk envelopes would be noticeably shorter and less bulky than this, and similar pre-war buildings proximate to the rezoning area. We also want to recognize that SoHo and NoHo aren't islands. They exist within a broader urban context. So bulk regulations have also been designed to respond to the character of surrounding neighborhoods like Hudson Square, Tribeca and Civic Center, Little Italy, Chinatown, and the East Village. Next slide, please. So to put these regulations into context, this is a view of Opportunity Area 1, bordering Hudson Square in a proposed M16 R10 district. As you can see, these massings fit within the range of buildings and bulk that we already see in this area. I also want to note the really high building street walls that are in keeping with the common loft building typology. Next slide. And here's a massing showing how new development would fit within the historic corridors in a proposed M15 R9X district. Again, the proposed height limits, setbacks, and high street walls ensure that new development and enlargements relate harmoniously to the surrounding historic context. Next slide. The same is true in the historic cores. I want to make clear that we are not proposing an upzoning of the historic cores. The maximum floor area ratio under M15A and M15B is 6.5, and the maximum allowed FAR under the proposed R7X M15 will be 6.5 FAR. And our modeling shows that these sites can comfortably accommodate their allowable FAR within the maximum bulk envelope, often undershooting their maximum allowable height. Next slide, please. This is a sketch looking at Opportunity Area 2 in the southeast corner of the rezoning area. We can clearly see that from the pedestrian's perspective, new development, like that red building in the middle ground, complements the look and feel of the neighborhood's historic fabric. Next slide, please. And as discussed in greater detail at certification, the proposed zoning districts and the special mixed-use district are meant to reinforce the mixed-use character of SoHo and NoHo, which is one of the qualities that makes these neighborhoods so unique and sets them apart from other areas of the city. So this proposal would map paired light manufacturing and residential districts across the project area, which allow the broadest possible range of uses. Most importantly, residential uses would become as of right, which is a necessary condition to create the kind of permanently affordable homes that the city and particularly this neighborhood so desperately need. The new regulations would also allow most community facilities as of right such as schools, theaters, art galleries, and things like that. There would also be more flexible rules for live-work arrangements, allowing for a broader range of commercial home occupations to support entrepreneurs and the small business ecosystem. Light manufacturing uses would continue to be allowed, preserving opportunities not only for the area's remaining industrial firms, but designers, artisans, and makers as well. An expanded set of commercial and light industrial uses would make possible new hybrid uses, such as retailers that also produce the goods being sold in the same space. I also want to note that joint living work quarters for artists, JLWQA, would continue to be an allowed manufacturing use. But importantly, the proposed rules would make it easier for all types of artists to live and practice their crafts side by side, including those who can't be certified because they don't fit within the city's and state's rather narrow definition of professional artists. And finally, the new paired districts would also remove caps on the size and types of retail and eating and drinking uses, providing much needed amenities for residents, workers, and visitors. And as the Commission's aware, SoHo and NoHo are internationally renowned retail destinations that contribute literally hundreds of millions of dollars to the city's and tax base, as well as quality retail jobs. So from the department's perspective, we think that SoHo and NoHo, there's a place for both, for small, medium, and large retail establishments to serve a diversity of patrons. So in light of ongoing concerns related to quality of life issues, we continue to work with stakeholders and our colleagues at the Department of Transportation, the Department of Sanitation to develop tools to address these issues. And our partners are going to be available on Thursday to speak to these things. Next slide, please. I'm going to hand it over to Sylvia.
Thank you, Andy. So to head things off on the housing piece, I want to first note that as with any neighborhood rezoning, our very first step is to take stock of publicly owned sites within the study area. And that's no difference in SoHo, NoHo. The challenges here is that our opportunities are quite limited. So there are only 2 city-owned DEP sites. They have critical watershed infrastructure below grade and require access. Therefore, they cannot be developed as housing. As the Commission may know, there is also the federally owned GSA parking garage at 2 Howard Street at the intersection of Howard and Center Street in SoHo. As you know, the site is not controlled by the city, but we have been looking at the sites for many years, since well before the SoHo NoHo rezoning effort. I'm sure Edith would be happy to attest to that. As part of SoHo NoHo, we have been and will continue to work with our federal elected officials on advancing these conversations that would make 2 Howard Street a housing site. Here, I'll note that including 2 Howard Street as part of the SoHo NoHo rezoning to allow housing is a necessary first step, and that's what the proposal does. Next slide, please. As Andy mentioned in the use provision section, part and parcel to allowing residential use is implementing mandatory inclusionary housing in the entire rezoning area. It will be the first MIH area in Manhattan Community District 2, one of the largest in the city, in the heart of Lower Manhattan, one of the most, one of the best connected, dynamic, high opportunity areas in the city and beyond. So NoHo would apply MIH to require income restricted, permanently affordable homes in new developments, conversions, as well as enlargements. Options 1 and 2 are proposed. As noted here on the slide, both MIH options are designed to serve a range of low and moderate income levels, averaging at 60% or 80% AMIs. To use option 1 as example, 60% AMI translates to an annual household income of about $61,000 for a family of 3. That is less than half of the median household income in SoHo and NoHo. Again, as the commission is familiar, 60% and 80% AMIs required as part of MIH are just the average. MIH options are designed to reach a range of incomes with requirements to reach even deeper affordability. Next slide, please. And as we covered as certification in greater detail, SoHo, NoHo tend to be significantly more white, higher income than both Manhattan and the city as a whole, with a much larger percentage of owner-occupied housing. Combined with the fact that SoHo NoHo has no income restricted affordable housing and has seen very little housing production over the last decade, you have an existing condition of the two neighborhoods that are less diverse and provide fewer opportunities for New Yorkers in terms of housing. The proposal in front of you will go a long way to expand housing opportunities and promote affordability and socioeconomic integration, something that the city's fair housing focused Where We Live report also emphasized. Next slide, please. As the commission may recall, the proposal also includes 2 targeted adjustments to the standard MIH provisions so that the program addresses the unique physical and regulatory context in SoHo NoHo. Here, I'll just summarize briefly. The first change is to take away the incentive to underbuild to get out of the MIH requirement, a concern we've heard from the local community as well as from our elected officials. This adjustment means that development and enlargement of any size would be subject to MIH as long as their residential zoning allowance is above the MIH threshold. The second change is to introduce a new BSA special permit so that physically constrained existing buildings have viable options to convert to residential and comply with MIH. During ULURP, we heard criticism that MIH is not good enough or that it's full of loopholes. I want to take a moment to note that MIH is the most ambitious and progressive program of its like in the nation and requires the biggest percentage of affordable set-aside. In SoHo NoHo, we do have the opportunity to apply this program where the market condition works in the program's favor so that we appropriately leverage the strong market here to deliver housing on private sites without the need for public subsidy. As mentioned a moment ago, the targeted tweaks to MIH here in the special SoHo NoHo district further ensure that we fully realize the affordable housing potential here. Next slide, please. As the commission may recall, so this is a chart that you've seen as certification. This chart shows the various housing types that exist in the city, and that SoHo NoHo currently only has market rate housing geared towards the upper end of the market oftentimes, and rent regulated housing, an important resource, but does not have income eligibility limits. The proposal would greatly expand housing options in SoHo NoHo by allowing more housing to be built overall and requiring income restricted affordable housing. This will secure affordable homes for low and moderate income families who will become the future residents of SoHo NoHo and also relieve market pressure in lower income neighborhoods. Next slide, please. For those who currently live in rent-regulated housing in SoHo NoHo, we understand that this is an important resource. I want to take a moment to reiterate that existing tenant protections will continue to govern these units in SoHo NoHo. As summarized on this slide, the 2019 reforms to relevant laws significantly strengthened tenant protections and restricted the ability of landlords to raise rents on stabilized units or remove them from rent stabilization program. Separately, I also want to note that based on HPD's research, the vast majority, close to 90% of all the buildings with rent-regulated units in SoHo NoHo are located within historic districts, where changes to these buildings will continue to require LPC approval as well. These protections notwithstanding, during ULURP, we heard loud and clear that many are still concerned about tenant harassment, and we're taking it seriously. We're in active conversation with HPD to identify any gaps in tenant outreach, education, and legal services as part of the neighborhood planning process. I'll note that HPD Commissioner Louise Carroll would be testifying at the hearing and answer questions related to housing, MIH, and rent regulations. Next slide, please. Now, onto the strategies related to joint living work quarters for artists, JLWQA, and the arts. Next slide, please. Here, just a quick reminder that the proposal draws from recommendations from Envision SoHo NoHo. Some key quotes taken from the Envision SoHo NoHo report are shown here for reference. The input we got was essentially to tackle two challenges at once. One, to reinforce SoHo NoHo's cultural identity, and two, at the same time, allow more varied residential occupancies and live-work arrangements beyond certified artists. Next slide, please. The proposal addresses both by providing the much needed optionality and the introduction of an arts fund. Existing JLWQAs can remain as they are. This means artists residing in JLWQAs today can continue to do so, and the unit can be sold, rented to certified artists as well, remain as JLWQA. Or they can be converted from JLWQA, a manufacturing use that is tied to artists' live work use group 17, to use group 2 residential use through a contribution towards an arts fund. The arts fund would be allocated under the Department of Cultural Affairs oversight. It could be by the city itself or a city designated entity. More on that shortly. So our goal here is to accommodate a broader range of people and occupancies that we know exist in the neighborhood, and also translate an outdated requirement into benefits for the arts in support of more public-oriented programming and projects in SoHo NoHo and the surrounding neighborhoods. I'll note that during ULURP, we heard concerns about conversion process itself being cumbersome. I want to mention that the intent here is to create a coordinated interagency process involving DCLA as well as DOB that works and provides a real viable option for folks that have asked for it. Next slide, please. And as noted as certification, the Arts Fund contribution rate is informed by the department's market analysis of units transacted in the last decade. So here I thought I would provide the commission a bit more detail on that. So this slide summarizes, in looking at DOF sales data in the last decade, we found that units without the artist occupancy requirement, essentially non-JLWQAs, sell consistently at a higher rate compared to JLWQAs on a per square foot basis. And the proposed contribution rate of $100 per square foot sort of lands on the lower end of that price differential and constitutes a very small percentage of a unit's market value. The proposed rate reflects an intent to strike a balance between creating a financially viable option to convert while providing supports for the arts. Next slide, please. So what could the Arts Fund achieve? In working with DCLA, our current thinking is that it can fund programmatic and capital needs for organizations as well as individuals within SoHo NoHo and the broader Lower Manhattan geography south of 14th Street shown on this map. Having heard many comments during ULURP about some misconceptions about the proposal. There are some who believe that the proposal undermines JLWQA as affordable artist housing. I want to take a moment to clarify 2 points. The first one is that JLWQA is not affordable housing. As the commission knows, the existing JLWQA regulations is a manufacturing use provision in zoning that ties the legal occupancy of a live workspace to a certified artist. It has no affordability requirement, nor does it provide support for the arts in any publicly oriented way. The second point I want to clarify is that the proposal, in fact, does not remove or force any existing JLWQA out of their current use. As covered a moment ago, an existing JLWQA may remain as JLWQA and continue to be a resource, a unique type of use in SoHo and NoHo. Again, we're very excited that the rezoning provides an opportunity to build upon what we have in SoHo NoHo already and do more for the arts. To Commission's questions and comments as certification, we, in partnership with DCLA, want to learn from past efforts intended to support the arts and structure this with an eye on viability and longevity for the arts and culture community. To that end, I'm happy to report that the DCLA Commissioner, Gonzalo Casal, will also be testifying at Thursday's hearing and answer the Commission's questions directly. With that, next slide, please. I'll turn it back to Andy to cover environmental review and ULURP recommendations.
Great, thanks, Sylvia. So this proposal has undergone a very thorough environmental review process, which analyzed all necessary impact categories in accordance with the 2020 Secret Technical Manual. Next slide, please. The draft environmental impact statement identified significant adverse impacts across 5 impact categories, including open space, shadows, historic and cultural resources, transportation, and construction. The EIS did not find any significant direct or indirect displacement impacts. Mitigation measures were identified in the DEIS and will be further analyzed in the final environmental impact statement. Next slide, please. Next slide. The public review process brought hundreds of stakeholders to the table to consider and provide feedback to the proposal. Manhattan Community Board 2 held 3 public meetings, 2 in person and 1 virtual. DCP and our colleagues at HPD attended each meeting, presented and answered questions of each. Ultimately, CB2 voted 36-1 to disapprove the application. While the board did not provide any conditions or recommendations to the application itself, their resolution did raise issues related to mandatory inclusionary housing, protections for existing rent-regulated units, quality of life issues, JLWQA and the Arts Fund, historic districts, mitigation of adverse impacts, and public engagement. As the commission is aware, we have covered many of these issues in this presentation, and we just, as well as other presentations that we walk through, including DCP, Community Board 2, and Borough President-led meetings as well. And as you saw at the outset of this presentation, our robust public engagement, which began in January of 2019, has continued up to the present with dozens of public meetings at which the Community Board and other stakeholders have been involved and provided enormously helpful feedback. The Borough President held a public meeting on August 23rd, which included a panel discussion with DCP, Community Board 2, affordable housing advocates, real estate professionals, and other neighborhood groups. And the Borough President's recommendation is expected shortly. Next slide. And with that, Sylvia and I are happy to take any questions.
Well, thanks certainly go to Sylvia and Andy for the comprehensive presentation, but I'll note that it is backed up by the balance of the Manhattan office, by our Environmental Assessment and Review Division, our General Counsel's Division, and folks across the agency who have worked to bring us to this point. And with that, yes, Commissioner Marin.
Thank you. Waiting for this. Okay, now we're on. So my question is to Sylvia. Sylvia, when you were discussing the category of expanded housing, and you would, and specifically on slide 16, you were talking about development of mandatory inclusionary housing, and I believe I heard you say that this would facilitate, this action may help to facilitate the development of affordable housing without subsidy, without public subsidy. Why would we, unless there's an action in here that I missed, why would we surmise that a developer would not go to HPD for subsidy for the affordable units?
So thanks, Commissioner Marin, for your question. I believe that Louis Carroll would have a lot more to say on this topic and can speak to it more knowledgeably. But I think I want to clarify one, as part of MIH requirement, to meet the MIH requirement and the required affordable units, there's no promise of public subsidy. The purpose of the MIH program is to make sure that we leverage the market to deliver affordable housing on private sites. That being said, we know there's always opportunities to even enhance MIH and to go beyond MIH, and that conversation is always welcome. And as far as I know, HPD is engaged in property owner outreach to make sure that we have these important conversations and realize the potential here.
I didn't mean to sort of suggest that developers, that the MIH program mandates public subsidy, but if I'm a developer and I know that these subsidies are available to me, and I know that I'm also in an area where mandatory inclusionary housing is a requirement, I would definitely go to the city of New York for some subsidy. And I think that we're going to find challenges here because what's to say who gets subsidy and who doesn't and why? So I really think that there's going to be, this conversation does need to be robust and HPD really needs to consider this because, again, if I'm developing affordable housing and I'm developing units under, I believe it's 80% of AMI, and let's call it a home ownership program, I'm not entitled. I can apply for $190,000 per unit per subsidy. So I just like to peel that back a little bit better, and if Commissioner Carroll could give us some more information, that would really be very helpful.
If I might, Commissioner Marin, we have seen in another application in Manhattan, a private application just south of Hudson Yards, that a high opportunity neighborhood, that the proposal came forward for a rezoning with MIH, which triggered, obviously, the affordability, and it went ahead without subsidy because the economics of the neighborhood allowed a project to pencil. The other thing that I feel certain Commissioner Carroll can speak to much more eloquently than I is that the pipeline of projects of developers thinking or wanting to seek subsidy exceeds the amount of subsidy that is available, so there are allocational. But totally take your point that any developer can seek subsidy regardless of how high opportunity a neighborhood.
Thank you. I would also then posit that if I'm a developer who wants subsidy and I think I can get it, then I may delay a project until the outer years just to get that subsidy. So we need to bear that in mind when we're looking at this proposal.
No, certainly. Commissioner Cirillo.
Thank you. Just a sort of clarity question on the arts fund proposal piece of this, which is obviously really interesting, and I'm sure will go a long way in terms of supporting arts and culture in the community. So I know in the presentation just now, it spoke of, and I think the term was the Department of Cultural Affairs would be sort of the oversight, which obviously makes sense. But is it the place where funding will be deposited, or will there be an independent, but sort of an offshoot new organization created? I'm likening this to Midtown East and the governing group, where money would be deposited somewhere else, where there would be a different process to determine where funding should go and what it should be funded for. So perhaps these details are still in the making, but I just wondered if it was possible to understand more about how that would work, how that's planning to work. And also one other piece to that, which is, you know, while we generally are talking about the rezoning district, and again, I'm comparing this, which might be not the best way to do it, to how the public realm piece of Midtown East worked. But in the presentation, it talked about those who were eligible to receive funding for programming, and then it was referred to as Lower Manhattan. So is there a different geography for eligibility versus the rezoning area itself? And so I'm just trying to get a grasp of that.
Thank you, Commissioner, for your question. I think you're right in guessing that a lot of the details of how the Arts Fund and administration of the Arts Fund are still being worked out. We are actively working with the Department of Cultural Affairs to figure out how to design a program that works, and also, drawing from the example that you used and also other, kind of funds that the city administers. I think the intention here is to leverage the expertise and the relationship that DCLA has with the New York City's and SoHo NoHo local cultural community. So the idea is it will not go into the general fund. It will be its separate pocket of money and dedicated for this particular purpose. In terms of, the entity that oversees the allocation of money, I think that's still being discussed. My understanding is DCLA can certainly serve that function, but there are also other models that may work even better or more effectively. So, for example, designating a nonprofit to administer the fund. So those are still in discussion, and I'm sure the Commissioner Gonzalo Casal would be happy to speak to that. And then in terms of the clarification on the geography, I think the idea is that, as far as zoning mechanism goes, there is always this nexus between, what we're trying to do, that there has to be a nexus between the fund and how it is used. And so here we want to stay close to home. So the goal is to look at SoHo NoHo, the study area, and slightly broader geography, which is 14th Street, Lower Manhattan. That is what we're looking at the moment. And the idea is that, neighborhoods do not exist in there as an island, and cultural communities in these adjacent neighborhoods are a kind of an ecosystem. So we're looking at a broader set of areas adjacent to SoHo NoHo as well. And one thing to note here is that, as part of the city's cultural plan, and DCLA can speak more to it, is that there are areas that are, underfunded, consistently underfunded in terms of arts and culture. And we want to also use this as an opportunity to see if there are opportunities to prioritize SoHo NoHo and surrounding neighborhoods that have been underfunded.
Okay, thank you for that. I understand. I hope, and I agree that, look, if you're bringing arts to any community, that's a positive. So, and obviously serving areas that are underserved right now for arts and culture will be critical. I just hope that there is a recognition, and what makes this perhaps attractive to some in the community is that, and this will go to the process of how money is actually allocated and to whom it is allocated, that there is still a recognition that the community that's actually creating the funding stream is somehow still a beneficiary of the benefits of the funding for the arts in the neighborhood itself. So again, that's a balancing act always, but I appreciate the response, and it'll be interesting to hear how the community and others, feel about that too. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Commissioner Ortiz.
Thank you. So I would agree, sort of the devil's in the detail on the Arts Fund. I'd be interested in hearing more about that. I think generally I do want to start by saying I think this is an incredibly well-balanced proposal that keeps in mind the historic preservation protections that, we all agree are very important, with the need for new development that pushes the envelope on affordability. I think that I see that very clearly. The Arts Fund, I question, how we do that. My experience having participated in the 125th Street rezoning, where a similar fund was developed as part of that and a commitment to small businesses. I can't say that I know. Maybe you can. My fellow commissioners can speak to that. But, what has happened, I would be interested what precedent we have as a city with supporting, very topic-specific funds as a result of rezonings. Presumably, we're not reinventing the wheel. So if we could find out how that's happened before and the success of that as implementation tool, I think that would be helpful for me. Thank you.
Thank you. Other comments? Commissioner Levin.
Yes, well, actually, I have two questions related to development potential, sort of leading off of Commissioner Marine's line of questions, and then one of my own. But before then, Sylvia, I just want to say how impressed I've been watching the grace with which you've led this through the variety of public discussions that have happened. I've watched some of the videos of the public meetings that have happened, and I'm just endlessly admiring of your tenacity, your grace under pressure, and I know that behind the scenes it can't have been easy. I send this out to your colleagues as well, and I look forward to a much more successful and respectful public discussion on Thursday. I think that would advance our process here very much, but before we're done, I just wanted to say thank you. So my questions are, one of the comments we've heard about the opportunity, the potential for new development here is that instead that we may be planning for housing, but given the flexibility in the zoning, we may very well see a lot of commercial development instead. And we certainly have had a history of zoning for one thing and getting another in neighborhoods across the city. And Commissioner Marine's question about the need for subsidy or the appetite of developers of building housing with MIH without a subsidy, might they not just decide, well, forget the housing, we're just going to build commercial because that's easier? I imagine that you all have thought through that, you know, the tension in that possibility. Is there any guidance you can give us about how you're seeing the balance? I know it's hard to predict what developers do in the future, but how should we think about that issue?
Yes, ma'am. So two things. I think we are putting our thumb on the scale of housing. So FARs for housing are the highest. 12 in the R10 districts, down to 9.7, and then 6.0 in the historic districts. So, you know, housing is our priority. I think number two,
we may have lost Andy. Edith, do you want to address that?
Sure, I will. I'm sure Andy will join us soon. Yes, Commissioner, thank you for that question. It's one that we certainly have been thinking a lot about during the review process and before the review process, and as we were developing the proposal. As Andy noted, our thumb is certainly on the side of residential because we have tipped residential. You know, we have provide more FAR for the residential use throughout the rezoning area. But we think it's very important to still have very healthy commercial FAR in SoHo and NoHo. And this is an acknowledgement of the incredibly dynamic mixed use districts that these places are. They're not just, you know, a lot of one use and a little of another, or, you know, or the other way around. This really is very balanced mixed use. And it's very attractive. It makes SoHo NoHo very dynamic and attractive to have so much commercial and retail and housing and culture and arts. And we want to further and we want to enhance this mixed use character and not to contradict it. We've also heard from businesses that, you know, they want to stay in SoHo NoHo and they would like the chance to grow and flourish in SoHo NoHo. And this is wonderful to hear. And we do support SoHo NoHo as good places to do commerce. It is incredibly located between two of the nation's largest CBDs. It has incredible transit. This is a very healthy and robust commercial center, SoHo and NoHo. It provides a lot of jobs, a lot of career opportunities. And again, with the access to transit, we think it's important to keep a healthy commercial FAR. But of course, we have heard throughout the process, requests to do even more to influence, to spur residential over commercial. So we're taking the comments, and here we are still in the public process. But we think it's very important to explain also why we think it's very important to have a robust commercial FAR as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Other questions? Okay, this public hearing will actually be on Thursday. And again, thank you to the team.